Welcome, everyone. My name is Jeff Kreipel. I am the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies in the School of Humanities here at Rice. Before I welcome our speaker and thank the Kazimi family, allow me also to welcome those attending digitally this evening. Please feel free to ask your questions via the Q&A function of the on-screen webinar. For those in physical attendance, please raise your hand if you have a question. After the talk, we will bring a microphone to you so that your question can be heard online as well. On behalf of Dean Kathleen Canning and the School of the Humanities, it is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the 4th annual Kazimi Lectures in Shi'i Studies. This is a lecture series that is made possible by a generous gift from the children of Syed Safdar and Samina Kazimi. I would especially like to acknowledge the presence this evening of Samina Kazimi and her siblings. I understand that your mother recently passed. Please accept our most heartfelt condolences. Tonight's speaker is Professor Nebil Husayn. Professor Husayn is Associate Professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Miami. He is a specialist in the field of Islamic studies. His research explores authoritarianism in the Middle East, debates on the caliphate, and the development of Islamic thought. Dr. Husayn began his work as an undergraduate at the University of Virginia, where he studied Arabic, Persian, Islamic history, and Muslim cultures before pursuing study abroad in Syria and Yemen for 4 years. During his time abroad, he pursued a seminary education with traditionally trained Sunni and Shi'i scholars. Dr. Husayn returned to the U.S. to obtain an M.A. in Arabic and Islamic Studies from Harvard University and a Ph.D. in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. He is the recipient of a Fulbright Award and the University of Miami Fellowship in the Arts and Humanities. The family of the Prophet Muhammad and the 4th Caliph Ali and their descendants occupy a central place in his research. Husayn's first book, Opposing the Imam, was published by Cambridge University Press 2021. It examines the history of early Muslims who were hostile to Islam's 4th Caliph Ali and his descendants. Husayn aims to continue interrogating the intellectual and political histories of this family in his future work. And I should add, we do have some copies here for sale and a signature if you're so moved. Please help me welcome Professor Nebil Husayn.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for being here today and taking time out of your busy schedules to hear me talk about theology and the early writing of history in the Muslim community. I'd also like to thank the organizers of this event, the School of Humanities at Rice University, and the host for this evening, or the family that has allowed this evening to be made possible with their generous contributions, the family of Syed Safdar and Samina Kazimi. And of course, for those in attendance, I'd like to thank you all for being here. Tonight we'll hear a little bit of some of the ideas that have been percolating in my head for the past 8 years, so please join me in this journey. I'm entitling the talk Memories of Ali in Sunni and Shi'i Islam. And the first question I'd ask is, how did we get here? Ali ibn Abi Talib, the 4th caliph in Islamic history, the man at the center of the portrait before you, was the close kinsman of the Prophet who married Muhammad's daughter Fatima and thus became the father of the Prophet's grandchildren. He's revered for his wisdom, his swordsmanship, and piety. He almost needs no introduction among Muslims. He's revered as a saint. In Shi'i Islam, he's the second holiest figure after the Prophet Muhammad. He's assassinated in 660 of the Common Era after 4 turbulent years as caliph. The ghettoizing of Ali, or what I would call the restricting of conversations on the political career of Ali, not only in Muslim culture, but in academia is quite common. His life and political career is usually or only ever discussed in the context of Shi'ism. The same can be said about his famous son Hassan, depicted on your left, and his son Hussein, depicted on your right. The latter being famously killed in a large-scale massacre that is commemorated each year in Shi'i culture. There's an unspoken rule that the heroes of Shi'ism and the life that they led after the Prophet's death is only to be discussed in Shi'i settings. And when they are discussed, the aim is to either implicitly or explicitly discredit Shi'i doctrines about these figures. So why write this book? This book aims to provide a context and a space to understand the tensions, the stories, and the evolution of understandings about the political lives of these figures in non-Shi'i settings. Thus, I directed my attention primarily to Sunnism, studying Sunni hadith considered canonical and others that were not. I turned to the literature of another sect prevalent in North Africa and Oman, the Ibadis. I also turned to an influential and rationalist theological school known as the Mu'tazila. I do this to understand the diverse ways in which the stories of Ali and his son Hussein have been told by Muslims outside of the context of Shi'ism. Now, the impetus to write this book came from the discovery that this venerated Sunni caliph and Shi'i Imam, and here I'm speaking of Ali, was once publicly reviled in Muslim culture. I hope to understand the processes that facilitated in the rehabilitation of his tarnished reputation in Sunni Islam. I also aim to understand the claims of Ali's antagonists and their grievances against him. The relative obscurity and or extinction of those groups upholding such views required that I look at Muslim literature across a number of genres. I engage in the first detailed study of the claims and arguments of Muslims who were opposed to the Caliphate of Ali, thus the title Opposing the Imam. Lastly, I wanted to understand the ways in which the views of early antagonists to Ali endure in Islamic theology and literature until today. So what are some key themes that we'll use tonight to discuss this topic? There are many schools within the religion of Islam, each one consisting of revered scholars to define what is orthodoxy, or correct belief in the sight of God. This evening, I want to primarily consider the ways in which Sunnism, the largest doctrinal school in the Muslim world, grappled with the diversity of stories and views on the life of Ali. Second, when I speak of canonical hadith collections, I'm speaking of those sayings of the Prophet that were compiled in the Sunni tradition that came to be sources for orthodoxy and orthopraxy, meaning Islamic law and ritual. The most revered collection is the one that is referred to in Arabic as the authentic collection of a scholar named Bukhari, who was active about 200 to 250 years after the Prophet's death. I don't want to get into the details, but the canonical culture around this book is one where faithful Sunnis believe that in terms of historicity, this collection is basically unimpeachable. It's comprised of hadith that are considered bona fide sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. Other revered collections may have authentic reports as well, but don't shame the same stature as Bukhari, which is considered reliable from cover to cover. You could say these other respected books can be used as references and scholars can investigate their contents for possibly authentic reports. Now, at the other end of the spectrum are biographical and historical texts. If you were a Sunni scholar who wished to define orthodoxy and you found a text that disagreed with your sensibilities and it came from a non-canonical source, the choice was easy. You simply dismissed its credibility. Since I consider Muslim literature across multiple genres, I compare claims about Ali made in all of these different types of sources, while acknowledging those that are canonical and those that are not. But then what happens when claims are made in canonical texts that scholars of orthodoxy consider to be incorrect? What are the tensions that arise when something is preserved in a text like Bukhari that other scholars said, wait, this is problematic? This is something I discuss in the final chapter of my book. Lastly, I want to stake some territory for reverence for Ali in Sunni culture. Or I can say reverence for Ali in non-Shi'i circles. This explains the phenomenon of hundreds of hadith praising him in Sunni literature and non-Shi'i theologians who painstakingly argued against other members of their school on why Ali was a saint, why he was a spiritual heir to the Prophet, why he was a judicious leader when he became ruler of the community. And they did this at a time in which their own peers, let's say within the Mu'tazili or Sunni community, may have scoffed or doubted at such doctrinal positions as only the views of the Shia, only the views of Shi'ism. I'd argue that while the earliest partisans of Ali were known by the identifier of Shi'i, meaning they were part of his army, they were part of his party, they were his partisans, hence the Arabic word Shi'i, English partisan, it expanded beyond this group to include Muslims who revered him while having political and theological allegiances elsewhere. Thus, reverence for Ali, or pro-Ali sentiment, over the 3 centuries that followed his death, I'd argue became a trans-sectarian phenomenon. Meaning, it was not just part of Shi'ism, but it gradually became part of Sunnism as well. Only a minority of Muslims followed a school dedicated to Ali and his family, or what became known as Shi'ism. The majority of Muslims, until today, understood religious and political authority as falling on all of the Prophet's disciples, rather than just his family. This hegemonic belief is the cornerstone of Sunnism. And so it's with that short introduction, I want to briefly consider the contours of pro-Ali sentiment and to understand the stature of Ali through Muslim literature about him. So, at the very end of chapter 33, verse 33 of the Quran, the verse reads, "Indeed, God desires to keep all impurities from you, O members of the house, and purify you a thorough purification." It's known as the verse of purity, and it's related in canonical sources that the Prophet took his daughter Fatima, Ali, and their 2 sons and prayed that God purify them when this verse was revealed. Muslims understood the Prophet's prayer to have been accepted and to have been answered. The community also agrees that Ali is the only caliph raised by the Prophet from infancy. On this subject, Ali is reported to have said in a collection of his aphorisms and letters entitled the Nahj al-Balagha, "Certainly you know my special status in the eyes of God's messenger and the close kinship I share with him. When I was only a child, he took charge of me and he brought me into his home. When I was a baby, he would hold me to his chest and cradle me in his arms. When I slept, I did so in his bed and beside him, so close that I could smell his fragrance. To feed me, he would first chew the food and then offer it to me. As a child, never did he find me speaking a lie, nor any foolishness in my actions." Here we see Ali discussing how he was the only person among the Prophet's disciples to be raised in his home. He states that even as a child, he was obedient to the Prophet and followed the path of virtue. For Shi'is, these statements reflect the infallibility of Ali, a doctrine upheld as orthodoxy in Shi'ism. And so Ali continues, "God sent a mighty angel to the Prophet in order to guide him both day and night along the path of fine morals and the perfection of character. During this time, I followed him like a young camel who follows the footprints of its mother. Every day he would stand as a banner and symbol of righteousness and morality and command me to follow him in this. Every year he would retreat and seclude himself in the mountains of Hira. There I would see him where no one else would see him. In those days, Islam did not exist in any house except in the house of God's Prophet. He lived in this house with his wife Khadija, and after these 2, I was the 3rd. I saw the light of divine revelation and breathed in the scent of prophethood." The question of authenticity aside, there's a sense here that the intent of this monologue is to convince the listener that Ali is clearly the best person to follow and trust after the Prophet. Ali is telling his audience that he had a uniquely intimate relationship with the Prophet. The implicit argument is that others can't claim to be superior to him in their knowledge of the Prophet or in being closer. It's true that the Prophet approved of Ali in ways that are unique. One indication of this is that the Prophet declined all other marriage proposals from prominent Muslims who wanted to marry his daughter Fatima. Both he and Fatima held that only Ali would be a suitable spouse for her. Shi'is believed that Fatima had a piety or spiritual stature that was peerless among women, and so her spouse was also to resemble her in this peerlessness. It can be said with confidence that the Prophet viewed Ali as his apprentice and trusted companion. It's for this reason that the Prophet says about Ali, "He is of my essence and I am of his." Or in another report, "Ali and myself are raised from the same light. You are my brother in this world and in the hereafter. You are unto me as Aaron was unto Moses." Now, so far we've considered characteristics of Ali that are affirmed in canonical sources. When we turn to non-canonical hadith, statements that medieval Sunni scholars did not affirm were authentic, we get into murkier waters. You could say the claim gets more provocative. Historians note that the Prophet said of Ali, "You are my heir, my vizier, and successor after me." This sounds pretty straightforward, regarding whom the Prophet favored as his successor. But there's a part of the statement that copyists of manuscripts could not agree on. In some places, the Prophet says, "Fi ahli," and in other manuscripts, the statement is "Fi ummati." The ramifications of either statement are predictably enormous, otherwise I wouldn't be bringing it up. According to one manuscript, the Prophet is simply noting that Ali will be the next chief of his family, namely the Hashemite tribe to which they both belonged. In another, the statement is much wider in scope. The Prophet is appointing him as his successor in the entire community. Since we're left with both versions, we're left asking, is this a Shi'i affirming text, a smoking gun, if you will, that was later defanged of its bite? Or is it an innocuous text enhanced with a Shi'i accretion? Which way does it go? The authors I study in this book, especially in chapters 3 and 5, dedicated to Al-Jahid and Ibn Taymiyyah, are adamant in supporting the second theory. So in this case, they are sure the Prophet said, "Fi ahli," that Ali is my successor amongst my kin. But later Shi'is amended the text so it read "Fi ummati," so that Ali was his successor in the entire Muslim community. It's with this assumption that these two authors go about what I call blunting the polemical edge of any pro-Ali hadith that they find which suggested he should be caliph. They argue either Shi'is made up these reports, embellished them, or read them out of their original context. Now, after the Prophet's death, the question of who would succeed him fragmented his disciples into a number of factions. The allegiances grew in their complexities as the decades passed. Here I'll try to start with simplicity and then gradually add to this knowledge base to help us frame the disagreements. First, there are those who supported authority going to the most senior members of the community who had the most clout. This faction became partisans of the first three caliphs. Not only did they revere the memory of these three caliphs and view them as pious authorities, but they also based Islamic law and knowledge of religion on the followers of these three. The second faction consisted of those who believed Ali was the natural heir to the Prophet. The clan to which the Prophet and Ali belonged was that of Hashim. Hashemite kinsmen and their partisans held Ali to be the most knowledgeable and distinguished of the Prophet's disciples, and they revered him after his death when other Muslims did not. The third faction to consider is represented by the clan of Ali's predecessor, the Umayyads. Ali's predecessor, Uthman, was assassinated after a siege of his home that lasted many weeks, if not months. And the family of Uthman blamed Ali for these events, since those who had laid siege to the caliph's home had respected Ali. Although Ali may not have been involved in the assassination, the Umayyads considered anyone who had criticized Uthman culpable in this hyper-partisan atmosphere that believed if you're not with us, you're against us. And thus, fomented tribal feuds. Thus, when Ali became the fourth caliph, the Umayyads rebelled against him. To Ali's dismay, the partisans of the first three caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, also rebelled against him, and thus his caliphate was rocked with civil war after civil war. Now, to take a bird's eye view of how it all panned out, after Ali's assassination, the Umayyads take the reins of the caliphate and turn it into a dynastic monarchy. They rule for close to a century. Then there's a wide-scale revolt that foments from Central Asia and heads west to topple them in Arabia. The leaders of this revolt pledge allegiance to the old rivals of the Umayyads, the Hashemids. And the Hashemids then have their own monarchy for 5 centuries until another army, the Mongols, lay siege to their empire and end their rule. Now, if we wanted to take snapshots of allegiances to different religious and political authorities 100 years after the Prophet's death, it would look something like this. You'd have 4 factions, with one of them split in 2. You'd have those who revere the first 3 caliphs, those who revere the Umayyad dynasty, and those who followed a Khariji school, an independent school discussed in the book, but which we won't tonight. Lastly, you'd have the pro-Ali faction split between those who say all authority should remain exclusive to Ali's family, and those who revered Ali and his descendants but were more broad in viewing other members of the community as authorities as well. For example, there may be some who viewed the first 2 caliphs, Abu Bakr and Umar, as wise and pious leaders, but also respected Ali. They did not view reverence for these different caliphs as necessarily contradictory. Now, if we take another snapshot 200 years after the Prophet's death, these different circles would still be intact, with a caveat that there is now a religious elite, scholars of the law and theology who have become fed up with caliphs claiming to be the successors of the Prophet. They are the drivers of a new ethic, that the scholars, the ulama, are the real heirs of the Prophet. So while you have scholars that identify with the above faction, with the previous factions that I've listed, there is a set of a new centrist group of scholars who keep an ethic of we cannot judge, or we will not judge, because we don't have enough certainty on who is right and who is wrong in all of these conflicts, since these conflicts occurred 2 centuries before. So they say we'll leave it to God to decide who to punish and who to reward in the hereafter. There are some who even have a more radical optimism. They'll say we might have our own theories on who is right and who is wrong, but we'll maintain a belief that God will forgive everyone who was involved. So now, if we wanted to locate Sunnism, it's part of this burgeoning community of centrist scholars who acknowledge that their own teachers and authorities were part of one of these factions, even if centrists themselves were not. Thus, to read a Sunni hadith collection is to read a work with contributions from those who are pro-3 Caliph, pro-Umayyad, pro-Hashemid, or somewhere in the middle as centrists. By contrast, it's fairly easy to read Shi'i texts or Shi'i works and understand their sources. They're mostly written by partisans of the family of Ali, who viewed them as the rightful imams or leaders of the community, both in terms of political power and religion. Our last snapshot is taken 300 years after the Prophet, and while I don't want to diminish the existence of other factions and schools both within and outside of Sunnism and Shi'ism, in terms of the enduring culture surrounding Ali, I describe Muslims as having one of 6 different views. The first group is made up of zealous pro-3 Caliph, pro-Umayyad, or Khariji Muslims who publicly condemn Ali and his partisans as evil. The second group doesn't condemn Ali outright, but they oppose any special veneration of him. They tend to say he was a fallible person who may have committed blunders and that he may have harmed the Muslim community when he became caliph, but he didn't intend to do so. Now, because he caused so many problems as caliph, this group too will say, in fact, he may never have become a legitimate caliph to begin with. That this was a time of civil strife. This was a time of sedition in which there was no caliph. The third group became the orthodox position of Sunni Islam. Ali is accepted as the 4th rightly guided caliph. The fourth group is associated with those pro-Alids that regarded him as the greatest Muslim after the Prophet, but didn't consider him divinely appointed. They held that Ali was the wisest and most meritorious Muslim, but didn't go so far to say that Muhammad appointed him as his successor. And so this is associated with some pro-Alid Mu'tazili and even Zaydi groups, Zaydi Shi'i groups. The fifth group became the orthodox position of Shi'ism. Ali was the rightful heir of the Prophet, selected by God and Muhammad before Muhammad's death. The sixth group was made up of those Shi'is that viewed Ali as a manifestation of the divine. In late antiquity, the belief in humans either being divine or demigods was quite commonplace. It seems most cultures believed that about rulers or had myths of this type regarding holy men. It seems foreign to us now, but for the exception of Christianity, where God or the Word is made flesh in Jesus. In this circle, stories about Ali's miraculous power over the universe, his omniscience, his omnipotence was a common motif. The absolute monotheism that usually is associated with Islam made Group 6 marginal and condemned by many Sunni and Shi'i scholars. If the spectrum could be laid out from 1 through 6, or those who held animosity for Ali, all the way down to those who believed in his divinity, it would look something like this slide. Now, all of this might seem a bit rudimentary, but I promise you the reason why I'm discussing this is that no one else has mapped out these nuances along this spectrum. The go-to model is anachronistic and tends to imagine Sunnism and Shi'ism as two branches that split apart at the Prophet's death. While the argument may require some charitable readings, my argument would be this. Sunnism is so wide in scope that its literature preserves members who seem to occupy these 6 groups, all 6 groups. If I was asked, I could place a Sunni scholar or a movement in each group. Shi'ism, by contrast, would only occupy groups 4 through 6 on this spectrum. So again, Group 1 held animosity for Ali. Group 2 avoided his praise. Group 3 accepted him as a rightly guided caliph. Group 4 held him to be superior to all other disciples of Muhammad. Group 5 held that God and the Prophet had anointed him Muhammad's rightful heir, and Group 6 upheld his divinity. So, if we were to zoom out 300 years after the Prophet's death, it's here that we can be certain people identify as Sunni and people identify as Shi'i. We can also discuss some of the cultural currents associated with the layperson belonging to each faction. So what do we find? Shi'is can be accurately described as centering Ali and the Prophet's family at the core of their religious culture. They have separate circles of learning, separate books, and rituals that Sunnis do not. For pro-Ali Sunnis, by this point they have come to revere Ali in very similar ways to Shi'i laypersons. He's a hero. He's remembered as unparalleled in his wisdom, unparalleled in combat. And the Prophet's descendants are also revered in Sunni societies as nobility. And then we have those Sunnis who are skeptical of all of this reverence for Ali and the authenticity of hadith that praise him. They tend to show sympathy for the Umayyads and scholars who were anti-Shi'i. Thus, when they discuss history, it's one that aims to discredit pro-Ali arguments in pro-Ali texts. And then there are those Sunnis who are mostly neutral on history, either in being uninformed or consciously not wanting to wade into controversial waters. Some Sunni laypersons remained aloof. The cultural code here is, I don't want to accidentally say something about a sacred figure that will offend God, who'll then punish me in the hereafter. As a result, I neither discuss nor take any position regarding these conflicts in early Islamic history. If the previous slide discussed laypersons, then here we can take a moment to consider the efforts of Sunni scholars who viewed themselves as representatives of orthodoxy. First, they sought to suppress and condemn overt anti-Ali sentiment in Sunni literature that was transmitted. It became heresy to curse Ali or accuse him of sinfulness. So searching for these texts at times feels like looking for needles in a haystack. While I want to take all the credit for finding these exceptional cases by browsing and reading every single volume cover to cover, my work is profoundly aided in the digital world, where I can use string searches to go through databases that have digitized thousands of medieval Islamic texts. And so what is it that I find? That Sunni scholars aim to discredit any whiff of Shi'ism. And this included texts portraying Ali as superior to his predecessors, or noting any disagreements he had with them. For example, after the Prophet's death, when Ali, Fatima, and the Prophet's family had disagreements with the first Caliph Abu Bakr, some scholars rationalized that such reports were likely false, because it didn't sit well with them to see these figures portrayed in this way, even though these texts appear in canonical collections like that of Bukhari. Third, scholars circulated reports in which Ali appeared as a fallible person. They may have done this unintentionally for two reasons. First, this organically happened whenever they drew on the legacy or contributions of that pro-3 caliph or Umayyad predecessors or members of those camps, as my research demonstrates. And second, it was infidelity to the belief in the canonical culture of hadith or the historicity of reports in these sacred collections that led scholars to say, well, in that case, I guess Ali must have upset the Prophet. And so a famous example of this, again in the canonical collection of Bukhari, is that when the Prophet visits the home of Ali and Fatima for night prayers, they refuse to join him, and the Prophet rebukes them. Or in another report, Ali tries to marry the daughter of a prominent adversary of the Muslim community who had persecuted the Prophet, and the Prophet delivers a sermon rebuking Ali. 2 centuries after the fall of the Umayyads, Ali was now a respected figure in Sunni culture. In this new context, scholars now always assumed that Ali would be forgiven and the error at stake was not so egregious as to lead him to be condemned. It's here we see how the reception of literature antagonistic to Ali in its origins can end up in circles that will charitably read it as not to condemn him, although the original authors, generations beforehand, may have intended to denigrate Ali outright. Let me close by stating that partisanship and the polarization of society outlasted the lifetimes of these 7th century rulers of Arabia. Muslim literature, both canonical and non-canonical, preserves the sentiments of all of these factions. A study of the formation of Sunni orthodoxy regarding Ali is a study of all of these sentiments. Lastly, I'd argue that polarization in American politics today is reminiscent of 7th century Hashemid and Umayyad rivalries and the historiography that ensued. President Obama is viewed as a good person and righteous leader by many, but he's reviled as evil and illegitimate by a rival tribe. During his tenure, there were some who supported a conspiracy theory that he was never born in the United States as evidence of his illegitimacy. 200 years from now, there will be partisans of Obama and many historians who will praise him. But there will also be a threat of antagonists, relying on right-wing authors, foreign journalists who were critical of Obama, saying that in terms of his policies related to drone warfare or other decisions that harm certain populations, that he's not the person that people make him out to be when they valorize him. The same goes for former President Donald Trump, who's a polarizing figure with avid followers. As we speak, we're creating competing historiographies and leaving them for posterity. As the decades pass, let's not be surprised with the spectrum that unfolds, as it did in Islamic history. Thank you very much.